The wind in this part of Wyoming territory did not just blow, it scoured. It came down from the peaks of the Bighorns carrying the memory of ice, slicing across the plains and finding every crack in Eli Morgan's small, sturdy cabin. It was a frost-bitten spring, the kind that promised green and delivered only frozen mud. Eli was riding the boundary of his land, checking the wire he'd spent last fall stringing. It was thankless work, but it was his. The land was all he had, a wide, empty bowl of grassland and sagebrush, bordered by craggy hills that turned purple at dusk. He had no neighbors for miles in any direction. He preferred it that way. The silence suited him, suited the man he'd become after the war and after the fever had taken Mary and the boy. He saw the shape near the creek bed as the light began to fail. At first, he thought it was a sick calf, strayed from his meager herd. He nudged his horse, a quiet buckskin. Closer. It was not a calf. It was a person, standing unsteadily by the half-frozen water, swaying like a willow branch. He stopped the horse. The figure was small. A woman. She was wearing only a thin shift, the kind of garment worn beneath a proper dress, or for sleeping. It was torn at the shoulder and smeared with dirt. She was barefoot. Eli swung down from the saddle, his movements stiff from the cold. The ground was hard, littered with sharp stones and patches of old snow. To be barefoot out here was madness. It was a death sentence. "Ma'am?" His voice was rough, rusted from disuse. The woman's head snapped toward him. Her eyes were wide, white all around, showing a terror so profound it struck Eli dumb for a second. She looked like a trapped animal, one that would chew its own leg off to get free. She was limping, favoring her left side, and when she tried to back away from him, she stumbled and fell to one knee. He saw blood on her feet, cracked and dark. "I ain't here to hurt you," Eli said, keeping his voice low. He held his hands up, away from the pistol on his hip. "You're freezing. You'll die out here." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She was young, maybe 20, maybe less. Her hair was matted with burrs and mud. She made no sound, just watched him, ready to bolt. "My cabin's just over that rise," he said, pointing. "There's a fire. Food. You can't stay here." She didn't move. The wind whipped her thin shift against her legs, outlining bones. He saw her shiver, a violent rattling shudder that seemed to shake her very soul. He took a slow step. She flinched, scrambling backward on her hands and one knee, dragging her injured foot. "Stop," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not chasing you, but the sun's down. The wolves will be out. You come with me, or you don't see morning. It's your choice." He waited. For a full minute. The only sound was the howling wind and the sharp stamp of his horse's hoof. Finally, she stopped trying to move away. She didn't get up, just stayed huddled on the frozen ground, defeated. Eli walked to her slowly. He shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the sheepskin lining worn but warm. He held it out. She stared at it, not his face. He gently draped it over her shoulders. She collapsed into the warmth of it, burying her face in the collar. "Can you walk?" She tried to push herself up, using only one arm. She grimaced, a sharp intake of breath, and fell back. Eli sighed. He was a man who hated complications, and this woman was the biggest complication to ever step onto his land. He bent down, sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She weighed almost nothing. She went rigid in his arms, stiff as a board. But she was too weak to fight. He carried her to the horse, lifted her onto the saddle, and then mounted behind her, holding her steady against his chest. She was trembling so hard he could feel it through his shirt. He turned the buckskin toward home. He brought her into the one-room cabin. The place was clean but spare. A bed in one corner, a stone hearth with a crackling fire, a dry sink, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. He set her down on one of the chairs, near the fire. She immediately curled in on herself, pulling his coat tighter, her wild eyes tracking every corner of the small room. He ladled what was left of a thin beef stew into a bowl and set it on the table. He added a piece of hard bread. "Eat," he said. She stared at the stew as if it might be poison, but the smell of the hot broth hit her, and her body betrayed her fear. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. She ate fast, desperately, spilling broth down her chin. Eli turned his back to her, pretending to busy himself at the stove, giving her the dignity of not being watched. When the bowl was clean, she set the spoon down. The sound was loud in the silence. He took the bowl and refilled it. She ate the second serving slower. He sat in the other chair, across the table, and rolled a cigarette. He didn't light it. He just worked the tobacco. "My name's Eli Morgan," he said to the floor. He waited. The fire popped. The wind moaned around the eaves. "Clara?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry scratch, like sand on wood. He nodded. "Clara." He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask where she came from, or why she was barefoot in a blizzard. A man in this territory learned fast that most folks were running from something. Asking questions was a good way to invite trouble, and he had enough trouble keeping himself alive. He motioned to the bed. "You take that. I'll sleep by the fire." She looked at the bed, then at him. Suspicion warred with an exhaustion so deep it looked like death. "I ain't going to touch you," he said flatly. "I just want to get through the night. Go on." She moved to the bed, sliding under the heavy quilts, still wearing his coat. She lay on her side, facing the wall, her body drawn tight into a knot. Eli laid his bedroll near the hearth, close enough for warmth but far enough to give her space. He took off his boots and his gun belt, laying the pistol near his hand. Habit. He banked the fire, turned down the kerosene lamp, and lay down. The cabin fell into a heavy quiet. He listened to her breathing. It was shallow, quick. She was not sleeping. He stared into the dying coals, his mind restless. He had his instincts, the ones that kept him alive in the war, and they were screaming. This woman wasn't just lost, she was hunted. He must have dozed, because the first scream ripped him from sleep. He was on his feet before his eyes were open, pistol in his hand, scanning the darkness. "No, get off! Don't!" It was Clara. She was sitting bolt upright in the bed, but she wasn't awake. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something he couldn't see. She was clawing at the log wall, her fingers digging into the wood. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp. She didn't hear him. She screamed again, a raw, throat-tearing sound of pure terror. She thrashed, kicking the quilts off, fighting an invisible attacker. Eli moved closer, keeping his distance. "Clara, wake up! You're dreaming!" She suddenly went silent. She gasped, her body seizing, and then she fell back onto the pillow, sobbing. They were dry, hitched sobs, choked off before they could make a sound. Eli stood there, the cold floor biting at his feet. The pistol felt heavy. He put it back on the floor and stoked the fire, adding a log. The new flames cast shadows that danced on the walls. He sat on his bedroll, his back against the hearth. He would not sleep again. He listened. An hour passed. Her breathing had evened out. But it wasn't the breathing of sleep. It was the breathing of someone holding perfectly still, listening. The second time, it started with a whimper. "Please, I can't. He was already watching her. She started to shake. Then the scream came, just as loud as the first. She threw herself sideways, trying to get out of the bed, tangling herself in the quilts and falling onto the floor. "Clara!" He moved to her, grabbing her shoulders. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at him, but she wasn't seeing him. She saw the man from her dream. She shrieked and slammed the heel of her hand into his nose. Pain exploded in his head. He fell back, blood gushing hot over his mouth. "Damn it," he hissed, pinching the bridge of his nose. The shock of hitting him seemed to wake her. She scrambled backward, crab-walking until she hit the wall, and huddled there, panting. She looked at him, at the blood, and her face crumpled. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice thick. He grabbed a rag from the dry sink and held it to his face. "It's just a dream." She didn't move. He went back to his spot by the fire. He sat there, upright, the bloody rag in his hand, and watched her. She eventually climbed back into the bed, but she didn't lie down. She sat with her back to the wall, knees drawn up, watching him. The third time, she didn't scream. She just started crying. A deep, hopeless sound that was worse than the screaming. He didn't move. He just sat and listened, his jaw tight. The fourth time, she clawed at her own throat, as if trying to pull something off. Her breath coming in short, panicked whistles. By the fifth time, the sky outside was turning a pale, sick gray. She jolted awake, a small cry, and then just stared at the ceiling, her body rigid. 5 times in one night. Eli got up as the sun hit the horizon. His nose throbbed. He felt exhausted. His instincts rubbed raw. He built the fire back up and put the coffee pot on. The smell of grounds and wood smoke filled the room. He didn't look at her. He moved about the cabin, pulling on his boots, checking his pistol. He could feel her watching him. He poured 2 cups of coffee, black and scalding. He put one on the table near her. "I got chores," he said, and he left. He worked all morning, his motions sharp and angry. He chopped wood, his axe splitting the frozen pine with vicious cracks. He fed the cattle, his shoulders hunched against the wind. The wind. He noticed it now. Every time a gust hit the cabin, it sounded like a rattling door, like a shout. He paused, listening, but it was just the empty plains. When he came back inside, she was dressed. He had left a pair of his old wool trousers and a spare flannel shirt on a chair. They were ridiculously large on her, cinched at the waist with a bit of rope she must have found, the sleeves rolled up. She had washed her face. The dirt was gone, revealing pale skin bruised under the eyes. She was standing by the door, just staring at the latch. He poured himself more coffee. "There's bread and some salt pork if you're hungry." She didn't turn. "I need to leave." "You won't last a day," he said, not unkindly. "You saw the land. There's nothing for 50 miles, and you got no boots? I can't stay. You ain't in no condition to go." He watched her. She was a coiled spring. Every sound, the kettle shifting, his boots scraping the floor, a log falling in the fire, made her jump. Her eyes never settled. They darted from the door to the single window, then back to the door. She never relaxed, not for a second. This was her brokenness. It wasn't just the visible wounds. It was the way she existed inside her own skin, like a prisoner waiting for the guard. A few days passed. The routine was brutal. He'd work the ranch all day, and at night, he'd sit by the fire and wait. The screaming never stopped. 5 times, sometimes 6. He'd wake before she did, hearing the change in her breathing. He would sit there, restless, and listen to her fight the ghosts. He tried sleeping in the barn, to give her the cabin, but he couldn't. He'd find himself standing at the barn door, listening toward the house, his instincts demanding he be closer, so he stayed on the floor by the fire. One morning, he woke to find her gone. His heart seized. He grabbed his coat and ran outside. The air was sharp, stinging his lungs. He saw her. She was at the far fence line, the one that marked the edge of his property. She was holding onto the post, staring out at the empty plains. She was trying to leave again. He walked toward her. She heard him, tensed, but didn't run. As he got closer, he saw she was shaking. She wasn't strong enough. She had made it 200 yards, and that was all she had. She pushed off the post, took one step, and her legs buckled. She collapsed onto the hard dirt. Eli reached her, his breath pluming. He didn't say a word. He didn't admonish her or ask her why. He just bent down, scooped her up, and carried her back to the house. He set her on the chair. She was crying silently, her face turned away in shame. As he set her down, the collar of the oversized shirt fell open. He saw it. Below her collarbone, there was a jagged wound, red and puckered. It was healing poorly, edged with infection. It wasn't a cut. It looked like a brand, or a burn, deliberately made. He looked at her arms, visible where the sleeves were rolled. They were littered with old scars, thin, white lines, clustered around her wrists, rope or chains. Eli felt a cold stillness settle over him, colder than the wind. He had seen what men did in war. He had not thought to find it here, in his house. His hands were trembling. He was angry, but the anger was so deep it felt like ice. He went to the small chest where he kept his supplies. He pulled out a tin of carbolic salve and a clean rag. He pulled the other chair in front of her. He knelt. She saw the salve and flinched, trying to pull the shirt closed. "It's festering," he said, his voice quiet. "It needs cleaning." "Don't," she whispered. It was the first word she'd spoken to him in 2 days. "I'm not asking." He gently pushed the shirt aside. She squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body rigid, bracing. His hands, rough and calloused from wire and wood, were surprisingly gentle. He dipped the rag in the warm water he'd fetched, cleaning the edges of the wound. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but didn't pull away. He spread the salve over the raw flesh. He worked in silence. He could feel the heat coming off the infection. He could feel the tremors running through her. He finished and carefully pulled the shirt back into place. He stayed kneeling for a moment, looking at the floor. "Is someone after you, Clara?" She didn't answer. She just bowed her head, her matted hair falling forward, hiding her face. That was answer enough. He stood up. "Stay put. Don't try to run again. You're just wasting energy." She began to help. She didn't ask. One morning he came in from the barn and she was sweeping the floor. The next day, she gathered the eggs from the hens, her movements quick and fearful, as if expecting the chickens to attack her. She started hauling wood, stacking it by the door. She was weak, but she worked until she swayed on her feet. He watched her from the window. The fear never left her face. She would stop, mid-task, and stare at the horizon, listening. But the work seemed to ground her. It was something to do besides watch the door. They existed in this rhythm, silent chores, silent, shared meals of coffee and bread. And the nights, the screaming, the clawing, the terror. One night, he was banking the fire. She spoke from the bed. "Don't lock the door." He paused, the shovel in his hand. He always locked the door. Always. It was the first thing he did when the sun went down. "Why?" "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. I can't be locked in. I can't." He looked at the heavy bar he always slid into place. He thought of the scars on her wrists. He put the bar on the floor, next to the door, but not in its bracket. "It ain't locked," he said. Another night, a week later. She spoke again, her voice small in the darkness. "Don't let them find me." It wasn't a request. It was a plea. She wasn't talking to the ghosts in her head. She was talking to him. Eli felt something shift in his chest, something heavy and forgotten. He was no longer just a man offering shelter. He was a man who had been asked for protection. He started sleeping lighter. He found he could wake just before the terror took her. In the few seconds when her breathing hitched and she began to moan. It happened again. He heard the breath catch. He got up from his bedroll before the scream could start. He moved to the bed in the dark. She was already tensing, her hands coming up. He didn't grab her. He placed his hands firmly on her shoulders, holding her steady against the mattress. She was vibrating with fear. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the night. "You're safe." She fought against his hands, not hearing him. "You're safe," he said again, louder. "Ain't nobody here. It's just me. Eli, you're in my cabin. You're safe." He kept his hands on her shoulders, an anchor in her nightmare. She stopped fighting. The scream that had been building in her throat died in a gasp. She opened her eyes. This time, she saw him. She saw the dark shape of him, the faint light of the coals outlining his form. She stared at him, her chest heaving. He didn't move his hands. He just held her there, keeping her in the present. She let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed back into the pillow. He let go and stepped back. The next night, he did it again. He woke. He went to her. He put his hands on her shoulders and spoke his name, spoke the word safe, until her eyes opened and she saw the room, not the cellar or the chains from her memory. They barely spoke during the day. He'd hand her a cup of coffee. She'd nod. He'd see her watching the horses. She'd see him cleaning his rifle. But the nights were different. The nights were where this fragile, unspoken thing was being built. He was the man who kept the fire lit. She was the woman who had brought the terror. And in the darkness of the high plains, with the wind scratching at the walls, he was becoming the only thing that stood between her and the ghosts. He wasn't just a harbor anymore. He was becoming a shield. The frost broke. It did not melt so much as it was fractured by a relentless, warming wind. And the land, frozen hard as iron, finally wept. The ground turned from stone to a thick, clinging mud that smelled of decay and new life. The creek roared. No longer a ribbon of ice, but a brown, angry torrent. Spring had come to Wyoming. Eli gave Clara a spade and a sack of seed potatoes. He took her to the small patch of land he tilled behind the cabin, protected from the worst of the wind by a stand of tough juniper. "We plant these," he said, driving his own spade into the earth. "Or we don't eat this winter." She learned. She watched him, mimicking his movements. She dug, dropped the cuttings, and covered them. The work was heavy. The mud sucked at the boots he had given her, a pair of Mary's, stuffed with rags to fit. Within an hour, her hands, still soft despite the chores, were raw. By noon, they were blistered. She kept working. She didn't complain. But her head was always up. She would stop, her body bent, and listen. Her eyes scanned the trees on the ridge, the line where the prairie met the hills. She was a woman planting roots, but she was still poised to flee. The work tired her in a new way, a deep-bodied ache that seemed to quiet her mind. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared sounds of labor, the rhythmic thunk of the spades, the grunts of effort, the companionable silence of two people working toward a single goal. One evening, they sat by the fire, boots steaming by the hearth. Clara was rubbing tallow into her blistered palms. She spoke to the flames, her voice low. It was a cellar. Eli didn't look up from the bridle he was mending. He just stopped his hands, listening, always dark. It smelled of damp stone and peppermint. She shuddered, a small, violent motion. His breath, he always chewed peppermint root. Eli's fingers tightened on the leather. He said nothing. He let the silence draw the poison out. "The chains were cold in the morning," she whispered. "So cold. She stopped. Her hands had gone still. She was back there, in the dark, smelling the peppermint. Eli resumed his work, the small, repetitive motion of the awl punching the leather. He didn't press. He didn't ask who or where. He just sat, a solid presence in the room, and let her speak. It was the first time she had offered a piece of her past without being prompted by a nightmare. The nights remained a battleground. The terror did not care that the ground was thawing. It came for her just the same, 5 times, sometimes more. She would jolt awake, the scream trapped in her throat, but the ritual had changed. He would wake, as he always did, to the sound of her hitched breath. He would cross the floor. She would be tensed, ready to fight. "Clara," he'd say, his voice rough with sleep. He would put his hands on her arms. At first, she had flinched from his touch. Now, she grasped him. Her fingers would dig into his forearms, her knuckles white. She was holding on, using him as an anchor to pull herself from the drowning dark. "You're safe," he'd murmur, the words the same every night. "Ain't nobody here. You're safe." He would hold her steady until the shaking eased, until her frantic breathing slowed. He would feel the tension leave her shoulders, and she would release his arms. One night, the dream must have been worse than usual. He held her, but the shaking didn't stop. She was fighting something with a terrible, silent strength. "Clara, you're here. You're with me." She collapsed against him. It was not a faint, but a surrender. She buried her face in the rough wool of his undershirt, and for the first time, she truly wept. Not the choked, dry sobs of her waking, but a deep, racking storm of grief that shook her entire body. Eli stood, rooted to the floor, his hands hovering, unsure. He was a man used to the silence of cattle and his own solitary grief. This was something else, something raw and terrifying. He slowly, carefully, put his arms around her. He held her. He held her as she cried for the cellar, for the chains, for the peppermint breath. He held her until his own arms ached and his shirt was soaked through. He was exhausted, his bones weary from the broken sleep, his nights now as shattered as hers. But he was tethered to her. This small, broken woman had become the center of his world, the thing his instincts were coiled to protect. He found himself watching her during the day. He saw the way the sunlight, weak as it was, caught the reddish glints in her brown hair. He saw the grim set of her jaw as she forced her blistered hands to grip the axe handle to chop kindling. He saw her will. He had seen men in the war with less fight than she had. He realized, with a jolt that was almost painful, that he was starting to fall for her. It was not the soft, easy feeling he'd had for Mary. This was something harder, something forged in darkness and desperation. He saw the beauty in her resilience, in her battered refusal to be erased. The change was in her, too. She was no longer just a shadow. She began to ask questions. They were mending the fence line on the north pasture, the wind brisk, but holding the promise of warmth. "Your hand," she said, nodding to the puckered scar on his left palm. "Shrapnel," he said. "Gettysburg." She processed this. "You were a soldier." "I was," he said, his voice flat, discouraging more, but she didn't stop. "Is that why you live here, so alone?" Eli stopped twisting the wire. He looked out at the plains. He hadn't spoken of this in years. "My wife, Mary, and my son, Thomas." Clara watched his profile. His face was granite. "There was a fever outbreak," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the horizon. 6 years ago? Came through in the fall. They didn't last the winter. I buried them both on the hill, just over that rise." He pointed. A small swell of land, bare save for 2 wooden crosses, nearly invisible from this distance. "I built this place for them," he said. "After they were gone, I just stayed. The quiet suited me." He went back to the wire, twisting it with a sharp, final motion. Clara was silent for a long time. That night, the cabin felt different. He had shared his own ghosts. He woke near midnight, not to a scream, but to the sound of the cabin door opening. He was on his feet in an instant. The cabin was empty. The bed was bare. He grabbed his rifle and burst outside. The moon was a sliver, the air cold. "Clara!" He found her in the barn, trying to burrow into a pile of hay. She had taken a horse blanket. "What in God's name are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, angry growl. She jumped, huddling in the hay. I can't stay in there. It's freezing. Get inside." "It's her bed," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. His grave. I'm soiled. Eli, I'm bringing my dirt into her. I can't. I'll sleep here. I'm used to barns." A cold fury filled him. It was not directed at her. It was at the men who had done this, who had taken her and broken her and left her feeling like refuse. "Mary is gone," he said, his voice hard. "The bed is just a bed, and you ain't sleeping with the animals, not while I'm breathing." He reached down, grabbed her arm, and pulled her to her feet. She was light, fragile. "No, please, get inside." He marched her back to the cabin, pushing her gently but firmly through the door. He barred it behind them. "You stay in that bed. It's warm. That's all that matters." He went back to his bedroll by the fire, his back to her, his whole body rigid with a protective anger he hadn't felt in years. He woke late. The sun was already up. His body ached. He had slept deeply, his anger and the night's confrontation pulling him under. He sat up. Clara was not in the bed. He found her by the stove, pouring him a cup of coffee. She moved stiffly. She hadn't slept either. She held the cup out to him. He took it, their fingers brushing. He expected her to pull away, as she always did. She didn't. He was standing, looking down at her. She looked up at him, her eyes clear. The terror receded, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sadness. She slowly, hesitantly, raised her hand. It was no longer soft, but it was small. She laid her palm against his cheek, his skin rough with a 2-day beard. He froze. It was the first time she had initiated contact. "You're the only man," she whispered, her voice thick, "who never touched me when I was too weak to say no." He closed his eyes. He could not speak. He just stood there, letting her small, calloused hand rest on his face, a penance and a prayer all at once. The invisible wall between them dissolved. It didn't crash down. It just melted away, like the last of the frost. A few days later, he was carving a new handle for his axe. He looked up and saw her watching the new foal try to chase a magpie. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the woman she might have been. He felt his heart lurch. They brushed hands when he passed her the water bucket. She didn't flinch. She met his eyes. They were moments, small as pebbles, but they were building a foundation. Then the storm came. It hit in the late afternoon, a black-bellied squall that turned the sky from blue to a bruised purple in minutes. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the yard to a lake. "The horses!" Eli yelled over the din. They ran to the barn, the wind tearing at them. They fought the heavy door open and staggered inside, soaked. The animals were restless, stamping and whinnying at the thunder. Eli moved to calm his buckskin, stroking the horse's neck. Clara went to the foal, who was trembling in the corner. The barn was dark, lit only by the bright, jagged flashes of lightning. The smell of wet hay, animals, and ozone filled the air. The roar of the rain on the roof was deafening. They worked, securing the stalls, checking the harness. The storm raged, enclosing them in a loud, violent world. They were shouting to be heard, but then, in a lull, they found themselves standing close, near the main door. They were both breathing hard. Rain dripped from their hair. Eli looked at her. Her face was pale in the dim light, her eyes wide, not with the night terror, but with the raw power of the storm, and with something else. He saw her look at his mouth. He didn't know who moved first, maybe neither of them. Maybe the storm just pushed them together. His hand came up to her jaw, his thumb brushing the water from her cheek. She leaned into his touch. He lowered his head. The kiss was hesitant. It was clumsy. It tasted of rain and salt and the lingering scent of coffee. It was not the kiss of practiced lovers. It was a question. She answered by rising on her toes, her cold hands coming up to grip his wet shirt. Her lips parted. It was breathless. It was filled with a desperate, unspoken longing. It was two survivors clinging to a piece of driftwood. A crash of thunder, so loud it shook the beams, made them break apart. They stared at each other, gasping, scared of what they had just done. Before either could speak, Eli's head snapped toward the sound of the yard. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "A horse," Eli said, his voice flat. "Not mine." He pushed her. "Hide, in the loft, now, and don't make a sound." She didn't argue. She scrambled up the ladder as Eli pulled his pistol from its holster on the wall peg. He cracked the barn door and peered through the rain. A man on a big roan horse was riding into the yard. He wore a long, yellow slicker, and his hat was pulled low. He stopped in front of the cabin and sat his horse, studying the place. Eli stepped out of the barn, the rain hitting him. He kept the pistol down, but his thumb was on the hammer. "You lost, mister!" Eli called out. The man turned his horse. He was big, with a mean, wet face. "Looking for someone. Man at the general store said you lived out this way." "I live out this way to be left alone," Eli said. "State your business." The man spat a stream of tobacco juice. It hissed in the mud. "Looking for a runaway, a whore, name of Clara. Stabbed a preacher down near Laramie and fled. You seen a woman like that? Small, brown hair, looks half-starved." From the shadows of the loft, Clara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. She had heard every word. Eli's face did not change. His eyes were cold as the rain. "Never heard the name. You're on the wrong ranch." The man squinted. looking past Eli at the cabin. "You sure? There's a reward. $50. A lot of coin for a girl who ain't worth a damn." "I said," Eli repeated, his voice dropping. "I don't know her, and I don't like strangers on my land. Ride on." Eli's hand came up, the pistol now level, pointing at the ground, but visible. The man stared at Eli, then at the gun. He grunted. "Your funeral, friend." He tugged his horse's head around and rode back out, disappearing into the gray sheet of the storm. Eli stood for a long time, the rain plastering his hair to his head. He finally turned and went back into the barn, bolting the door. He looked up at the loft. "He's gone." Clara came down the ladder. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Whore," she whispered. "He called me. $50. Clara." "He's right," she said, her voice dead. "That's all I am." She pushed past him and ran through the rain to the cabin. That night was different. The nightmares didn't come. Eli lay on his bedroll, his gun beside him, and listened to Clara in the bed. She was not sleeping. She was crying. Silent, agonizing tears. He did not go to her. He did not know what to say. The outside world had found them. The kiss in the barn felt like something from another lifetime. He must have fallen asleep, his exhaustion finally claiming him. He woke to silence, a deep, unnatural quiet. The storm had passed. The fire was embers, and the cabin was cold. He sat up. "Clara?" The bed was empty. The quilts were thrown back. He saw it, lying on the pillow, a small, torn piece of white cloth, a handkerchief, one he'd given her to wipe her hands. "No." He scrambled to his feet. The bar on the door was gone. She had fled. She had fled into the cold, dark mud, terrified of endangering him, running from the names the man had called her. "Damn it, Clara! Damn it!" He didn't bother with coffee. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his coat and his rifle, and ran to the barn. He saddled the buckskin in the dark, his hands moving with a frantic, angry energy. He knew where she'd go. She wouldn't go toward the town. She'd go toward the river, toward the wilderness, toward death. He rode hard. The moon was gone. The world a mess of black shadows and slick, treacherous mud. The air was frigid. She was on foot, in the dark, with no food and no coat. He found her at the riverbank. The storm had turned the creek into a raging, swollen monster, a churning torrent of brown water and debris. She was standing at the edge, wading into the icy water. She was going to try to cross. It was suicide. "Clara!" he roared. She turned, her face a white mask of terror in the gloom. When she saw him, she didn't look relieved. She looked horrified. "Go back!" she screamed, her voice thin against the river's roar. "Go back! Eli, they'll find me! They'll kill you! Get out of the water! No, I'm poison! I'm bringing death to you! Just let me go!" She took another step in, the current grabbing her, pulling her off her feet. Eli was off the horse before she went under. He plunged into the freezing water, the shock of it stealing his breath. He grabbed her, his fingers tangling in her thin shirt. She fought him, clawing at him, screaming for him to let her die. He didn't listen. He got his arm around her waist, and with a strength born of pure, cold rage, he dragged her from the water. He hauled her back onto the muddy bank. She collapsed, choking and sobbing. He was shaking, from the cold and the fury. "You want to die? Is that it? You'll die, but you'll do it where I tell you, not here." He threw her onto the horse, his movements rough, and mounted behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, pressing her shivering body to his, and spurred the horse back toward the cabin. He kicked the door open and half-carried, half-dragged her inside. He barred the door, sliding the heavy wood into place with a definitive thud. He turned to her. They were both soaked, shaking, covered in mud. The fire was almost dead. You should have left me," she sobbed, sinking to the floor. That preacher, Did you kill him?" Eli asked, his voice low. She looked up, her face broken. "No," she whispered. "But I should have. The confession hung in the air, raw and final. He stood over her, dripping, his heart hammering. All the fear, all the anger, all the desperation of the last 2 days, the kiss, the rider, the flight, the river, it all crashed together. He knelt in front of her. He didn't speak. He began to unbutton her wet, muddy shirt. His hands were shaking. This was not gentle. It was necessary. She was freezing to death. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just watched his face. He pulled the ruined shirt off her, exposing her shoulders, the scarred skin. He stripped off his own wet shirt, tossing it aside. The air in the cabin was ice cold, but the skin of his chest was hot. He pulled her to her feet. They stood by the dying embers. 2 people stripped bare, soaked and shaking. He looked at her, at the wound healing beneath her collarbone, at the fear in her eyes, at the resilience that had carried her through hell. He cupped her face, his thumbs wiping the mud and tears from her cheeks. "You're alive, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. "You're alive." He kissed her. It was not the hesitant, rain-soaked kiss from the barn. This was a desperate, claiming kiss. It was fire and ice. It was a vow. He lifted her and carried her to the bed. It was not Mary's bed. It was just a bed. They fell onto the quilts, a tangle of cold limbs in desperate need. This was not perfect. It was not easy. It was clumsy and aching and raw. It was the frantic, vulnerable need to feel alive, to erase the cellar and the preacher and the cold river. It was a drowning man's first breath. And in the dark, cold cabin, with the wind picking up again outside, they clung to each other, a confirmation of life in the face of death. The dawn that followed was not a reprieve, but a judgment. The cabin was still, the storm outside having given way to a sharp, brittle cold. They were dressed in dry clothes, the fire rebuilt and crackling, but the air between them was thick with the recklessness of the night. What they had done, born of desperation and the river's chill, had changed the foundation of their arrangement. She was no longer just a woman he was sheltering. He was no longer just the man by the fire. Eli made coffee, his movements precise, almost mechanical. He handed her a cup. She took it, her hands trembling. She sat at the small table. He stood by the hearth, his back to her. The silence stretched, filled only by the pop of the pine logs. Clara spoke to his back, her voice a dry rasp. His name was Preacher Silas. Eli did not move, but his shoulders tensed. He had not asked. He knew, after the river, that he finally had to hear it. "He ran a sanctuary," she said, the word sanctuary sounding like a curse. "In Laramie, a place for troubled girls, orphans, runaways, girls no one would miss." She stared into her cup, her reflection wavering on the black surface. "We weren't troubled. We were just alone. He took us in. He gave us food and a bed. He told us we owed him our souls. He told us we had to be cleansed." Eli turned, his face hard, unreadable. He watched her. The cleansing. It was him in the cellar. She choked on the word, the memory of peppermint and cold chains rising in her throat. He said we were paying our debt to God. He quoted scripture while he... She could not say the word. She didn't have to. Eli saw the truth in the jagged, healed wound beneath her collarbone, the one he had applied salve to. "But that wasn't the worst of it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The sanctuary was a lie. It was a store. He sold us to men from the town. Men with coin and good reputations. Men who wanted silence." Eli's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He thought of the rider, the one who had called her a whore. "They kept us in the cellar. He told them we were sinners, that they were doing God's work by punishing us." She looked up, her eyes hollow, pleading with him to understand. "I was there for 2 years. Clara," he said, his voice a low growl. "I tried to leave. I tried so many times. But he was strong. And the locks?" She touched the old, thin scars on her wrists. "Then one night, he came to my room. He was drunk. He forgot to lock the chains." She was shaking, reliving it, her knuckles white on the cup. "There was a fire poker. in the hearth. He turned his back, and She took a sharp, ragged breath. I took the poker from the fire. It was glowing. I hit him. I hit him in the back. He fell. He screamed. And I kept hitting him. I hit him until he stopped moving. Until the screaming stopped, the cabin was dead silent. "I don't know if he lived," she whispered. I just ran. I ran until my feet bled. I ran until you found me. The men who came here, they weren't just bounty hunters. Eli, they were customers. They want me back. For what I did to Silas, or just because they paid for me." She had laid the truth bare. It was an ugly, heavy thing, and it now sat between them. She watched him, expecting the disgust, the judgment, expecting him to tell her to leave. Eli stood for a long time. He looked at her, this small, broken woman who had fought hell with a fire poker. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained. He walked to the table and refilled his coffee cup. He took a slow drink, the scalding liquid burning his throat. Then he looked her square in the eye. His voice was quiet, but it was the quiet of a flat, heavy stone. "Even if you had killed him," Eli said, "I'd still want you here." Clara stared at him. She had expected rage or pity. She had not expected acceptance. A single tear, hot and slow, rolled down her cheek. It was not a tear of fear, but of a profound, painful relief. She lowered her head to the table and, for the first time since she had arrived, she did not cry from terror, but from the simple, shocking grace of his words. The confession broke the last of the ice. The spring, in turn, broke the land. The world outside the cabin turned a fragile, hopeful green. Clara changed. She worked beside Eli, no longer a ghost but a presence. She helped him clear stones from the potato patch. She learned to mend his shirts, her stitches small and uneven but tight. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, of his life. She began to heal. One afternoon, she was feeding the chickens when Eli's old billy goat, a foul-tempered creature named Samson, decided to exert his authority. He had been trying to mount one of the sheep, a large, placid ewe who wanted nothing to do with him. The goat backed up, took a running start, and leaped. The ewe, without even looking, simply sidestepped. Samson sailed past, landing in a heap in the mud trough, emerging with a look of profound, sputtering indignation. Clara, who had been watching, let out a sound. It was a short, sharp bark. She clapped her hand over her mouth, shocked at herself. Then she saw the goat shake his head, spraying mud everywhere, and the bark turned into a laugh. It was a real, full-bodied laugh, rusty from disuse but bright as a new penny. Eli, leaning on the corral fence, stopped his work. He had not heard that sound. He had not heard any laugh, save for the bitter cackles of men in town. In years, he watched her, a small, rare smile touching his own lips. It was the first truly good sound he had heard in his home since Mary and Thomas had died. But the good moments were ghosts, too. They did not last. The guilt remained. It was a heavy, cold thing that settled in her belly. After she laughed, she would grow quiet, her face closing. She saw herself as soiled, as ruined. She was the woman from the cellar. She was the whore the writer had named. How could this man, Eli, who was quiet and decent and scarred by his own honorable grief, want her? She was invading his life, bringing her darkness into the space he had built for his wife and son. She was unworthy. She began to pull away. She would finish her chores and retreat to the far side of the cabin, busying herself with mending. She would hand him his plate at dinner and make sure their fingers did not touch. She was trying to protect him from her, to keep the dirt from spreading. But the wall she built was purely emotional. The physical bond, forged in the terror of the river and the raw honesty of the morning after, was undeniable. It was a current that ran hot and fast beneath the surface of their quiet days. Their bodies, it seemed, understood what their minds could not. They shared stolen moments, sharp and aching with a need that defied her guilt. One evening, he was in the barn, stacking the last of the winter hay in the loft. She came in with a bucket of water for the horses. The barn was warm, smelling of sweet grass and animal sweat. He was in the loft, his shirt off, his body slick with perspiration. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Neither said a word. He came down the ladder. He pulled her into the shadows of an empty stall. The kiss was not tender. It was hungry, almost angry. It was a rebellion against the whispers, against the preacher, against her own feelings of unworthiness. He pressed her against the rough-hewn wood, and she arched against him, her hands gripping his shoulders. It was fast and fierce, and left them both breathless and shaking. Another time, they were checking the cattle on the far pasture as the sun went down. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, littered with the first stars. The silence of the plains was absolute. "No one can see us out here," she whispered. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. They were utterly alone. He spread his saddle blanket on the cooling grass. They made love under the open sky. A slow, deliberate claiming. It was a defiance of the cellar, a way of replacing the memory of darkness and chains with the vast, clean emptiness of the Wyoming night. Each time, she trusted him more. She let him see her, all of her. He had moved his bedroll from the fire. He slept in the bed now. Some nights, they just lay side by side, not touching, the space between them a comfort. Other nights, she would turn to him, or he to her, and beneath the quilts, they would find each other. He kissed the jagged scar on her collarbone. He kissed the white lines on her wrists. He worshipped what other men had tried to ruin, and with every touch, he was telling her she was not soiled. But the world was larger than the boundaries of the ranch. They needed supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and, most importantly, ammunition. They rode to town together. It was the first time she had been off his land. As they rode down the single muddy street, she felt the eyes. People stopped. Men on the boardwalk paused their whittling. Women, clustered outside the general store, went silent, their faces hardening. Clara pulled her gaze down, focusing on the horn of her saddle. They entered Henderson's general store. The warm air smelled of tobacco, pickles, and bolt cloth. The proprietor, Mr. Henderson, looked up, his friendly greeting dying when he saw Clara behind Eli. Eli walked to the counter and laid his list down. "Need these things." Henderson nodded curtly, turning to gather the items. Two old-timers by the pot-bellied stove watched them, their eyes missing nothing. As Henderson bagged the flour, he leaned in toward Eli, keeping his voice low. "Eli, you're a good man. Been through enough grief. God knows, a man's business is his own, but you should keep better company." His eyes flicked to Clara, who stood by the door, pretending to inspect a barrel of nails. Eli's face went cold. He placed his coins on the counter. They rang loudly in the quiet store. "I'll choose my own company. Henderson," he said, his voice flat, "and I'll thank you to just fill the order." The ride home was silent, the small sack of goods feeling heavy on the saddle. The whispers were no longer just in Clara's head. They were real. The whispers found their way to the ranch. A week later, Eli rode back from his monthly trip to the mail drop. 10 miles east. He held a single, crumpled envelope. It had no return address. His name was written in a crude, forceful hand. He opened it inside the cabin. Clara was kneading bread, her hands dusted with flour. He read the few words, his face tightening. Clara stopped, her hands freezing in the dough. "Eli, what is it?" He stared at the paper. "We know she's there. You'll regret it." Clara's blood ran cold. The terror, which had been sleeping, woke instantly. "What does it say?" Eli crushed the paper in his fist and threw it into the fire. It flared, turning to black ash. "Nothing. It's them, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice climbing. They know. Oh, God." She ripped her hands from the dough, frantically wiping the flour on her apron. "I have to go. Eli, I have to leave. I told you I was poison. I told you. They'll kill you. They'll burn this place." She was grabbing her coat, the old one he'd given her. No. He moved to the door, blocking her path. He was a solid, immovable object. Get out of my way. I won't be the reason you die. You're done running, he said, his voice a low command. He grabbed her shoulders. This is your home. You think I let that preacher or those cowardly townsfolk? Tell me who lives in my home. They'll kill you, she shrieked, hitting his chest with her floured hands. Let them try, he said. You have a right to stay. You have a right to fight. He let go of her and went to the heavy oak chest where he kept his things from the war. He opened it. He pulled out a small pistol, a Colt cloverleaf revolver, small enough for her hand but heavy enough to mean something. He pressed it into her palm. What is this? This, he said, is how you fight. If you're going to stay, you're going to learn. He took her outside, away from the cabin, and set 3 empty bean tins on the fence. He showed her how to load it, how to hold it with both hands. She took the gun. It was heavy, cold. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely aim. I can't. Yes, you can. He stood behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall at her back. Squeeze. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. She closed her eyes and fired. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed off the hills. The shot hit the dirt 10 feet to the left. She yelped, dropping the gun. Pick it up, he said, his voice calm, relentless. She picked it up, her hands trembling. Again, she fired. Missed. She fired again. Missed. Tears of frustration and fear streamed down her face. Stop crying, he commanded, not unkindly. Tears won't stop them. Aim. She wiped her face with her sleeve, her jaw set. She breathed in, aimed, and squeezed. The ping of the bullet hitting the tin was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. The can flew off the post. She stared at it, her chest heaving. A fierce, shaky determination settled on her face. She reloaded the gun herself. The nights changed again. The letter, the gun, the threat. It all seeped into her sleep. One night, Eli woke. He heard the breath hitch. He started to rise from the bed, but the scream that came was different. It was not the high, thin shriek of pure terror. It was a bellow of rage. Get off me, she roared. She was not clawing at the walls. She was fighting. She sat bolt upright and began punching the air, flailing, her fists clenched. Get off! I'll kill you! I'll kill you! Eli grabbed her, trying to stop her from hurting herself. Clara! Clara! Wake up! You're dreaming! She fought him, landing a solid blow on his shoulder. Get off! He pinned her arms. Clara! It's me! It's Eli! You're safe! Her eyes snapped open. She was panting, wild, her fist drawn back to strike his face. She stared at him, the recognition dawning slowly. The man in her bed was not the man from the cellar. He held her shoulders, his grip firm. It's all right, he said, his voice steady. You're fighting him. You're not there anymore. She collapsed against his chest, not with the hopeless sobs of before, but with the shuddering adrenaline of a battle. He held her. She wasn't just a victim anymore. Even in her sleep, she was a fighter. The next morning, the cabin was quiet. The nightmare had passed. But something new had settled in its place. A resolve. Eli stood at the dry sink, his back to her, carefully dragging a straight razor down his cheek. He was scraping off a week's worth of stubble. He finished, splashed water on his face, and turned. She was standing right behind him, closer than he'd realized. Her eyes were clear, dark, and unwavering. Before he could speak, she grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands, pulled his head down, and kissed him. It was not the hesitant kiss of the barn, nor the desperate claiming by the river. This was a fierce, proprietary kiss. It was a vow. It was a choice. She pulled back, just enough to speak, her forehead resting against his. I want to belong to you, she whispered, her voice raw. Fully, I'm not his, I'm not theirs. She met his eyes. I want to be yours. Her declaration hung in the air, a vow spoken in the quiet of the morning. I want to be yours. It was a claim, a statement of belonging that was more binding than any law or preacher's words. Eli had simply nodded, his eyes holding hers. He had accepted. They did not go to town immediately. They waited, perhaps 7 days. The threat of the letter lay on the cabin like a low-hanging cloud. But the air inside was different. Clara's decision had burned away the last of her shame. She had fought her ghosts and won. Now, she was preparing to fight real men. When the day came, it was Eli who decided. "We're low on flour," he said. It was a simple statement, but they both knew its meaning. He was not going alone. She dressed with care. She wore the trousers and shirt, sturdy and practical. Over them, she wore a worn jacket he had given her, and beneath it, tucked into her waistband, was the small Colt revolver. She felt its weight, a cold, solid reassurance. He saddled both horses. He rode his buckskin, his rifle in its scabbard. She rode the bay mare. They rode side by side, not as a man and his ward, but as a man and his woman. The ride was quiet. Clara watched the ridges, her eyes sharp. The fear was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the freezing panic of a trapped animal. It was the keen, sharp-edged alertness of a hunter. When they reached the town, the street was busy. A freight wagon was unloading in front of the saloon. Men gathered on the boardwalks. The moment they were seen, the talking stopped. It was not a gradual quieting. It was a sudden, heavy silence, as if a door had been slammed shut. Men stopped whittling. They stopped talking. They just turned and stared. Women gathered outside the mercantile, pulled their shawls tighter and turned their backs, ushering their children away. Clara felt the heat of their judgment. Her first instinct was to look down, to hide. She felt Eli's presence beside her, steady as a rock. He was looking straight ahead, his face impassive. She lifted her chin. She looked straight ahead, too. They dismounted in front of Henderson's general store. Eli looped his reins over the hitching post. As Clara swung down from the mare, a man, leaning against a post, deliberately spat a stream of tobacco juice. It landed in the dust, inches from her boot. Clara froze. She saw the dark stain in the dirt. It was a violation. "Filthy," a voice slurred. She looked up. The man who spat was Jed, a local loafer who spent his days drinking away a small inheritance. He was flanked by 2 others, their faces mean with drink and self-importance. "That's the church whore," another man, one she didn't know, said. His voice was loud, meant to carry across the street. "The one who lives in sin with Morgan." Eli, who had been tying his reins, did not speak. His movements became very deliberate. He gave his reins to Clara, who took them, her hand trembling. He stepped off the boardwalk. He did not rush. He walked the 3 steps to where Jed stood, grinning. "Got something to say?" "Morgan," Jed sneered. Emboldened by his friends, Eli said no words. His right hand, a fist hard as granite, moved in a short, brutal arc. The sound was a dull, wet crack. Jed's head snapped back, his grin vanishing. He crumpled, unconscious, into the dirt. The other 2 men, who had been laughing, stumbled backward, their hands raised. The street was dead silent. Eli had not drawn his gun. He had not raised his voice. He had simply delivered judgment. He looked at the 2 remaining men, his eyes flat and cold. They scrambled away, dragging their friend. Eli turned his back on them. He walked back to Clara, took the reins from her shaking hand, and tied them to the post. "Wait here," he said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. He walked into the general store. Clara stood by the horses. She was shaking, but not with fear. A wild, hot energy was singing in her veins. He had defended her. He had claimed her, not with words, but with an act of violence so swift and final it left no room for argument. She was still standing there when Sheriff Brody crossed the street. He was an older man, his face worn by years of trying to keep peace in a lawless land. He had not been there for the fight, but he had clearly heard the commotion. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Clara. "Morgan inside?" "He is," she said. her voice small. "Eli," Brody called. Stepping up onto the boardwalk, Eli appeared in the doorway, a sack of flour in his hand. Henderson was behind him, his face pale and anxious. "A word, Eli," the sheriff said, his voice tired. He nodded toward his office across the street. Eli set the flour sack down. "Clara, get the rest. I'll be there." He followed the sheriff. Clara entered the store, her head held high. Henderson and the others inside did not meet her eyes. They gathered her supplies: salt, coffee, beans, and a small box of cartridges for the Colt, and took her coins without a word. When she came out, Eli was still in the sheriff's office. She loaded the supplies into the saddlebags, her movements efficient. She would not be hurried. She would not be intimidated. She finished and stood by the horses, waiting. After 10 long minutes, Eli came out. His face was set, harder than before. "We're leaving," he said. He helped her mount, then swung onto his own horse. They rode out of town. This time, no one spoke, no one spat. They just watched, their eyes filled with fear and resentment. The ride back to the ranch was wrapped in a thick, heavy silence. The victory in town felt sour. Eli rode with his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Clara waited until they were inside the cabin, the door barred, the supplies put away. The sun was setting, filling the room with a bloody light. "What did he say?" she asked. Eli stood at the window, staring out at the land. "The man I hit, Jed, his cousin is the telegraph operator." Clara's blood chilled. "What does that mean?" "It means," Eli said, turning to face her, "that the sheriff got a wire this morning. From Laramie, the one Jed's cousin sent was an answer." "An answer to what?" "They know you're here. Clara, the sheriff knew before we even rode in. He said men from the preacher's town are expected. A whole group. They're not just bounty hunters. They're friends of Silas." "Customers?" she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Brody. He warned me. He said they'll be here within the week. He said for the peace of the town." "I should turn you in." Clara sank onto the chair. "For peace. He said he can't stop them. He said it's Laramie's jurisdiction, and if they come with a warrant for a fugitive, he'll have to stand aside." "So he's offering us to them," Clara said, "to save his own town." "That's the long and short of it," Eli said. The last of the light died, plunging the cabin into shadow. The fire crackled, oblivious. Clara stood up. She walked to the peg by the door and took down her coat. "What are you doing?" Eli asked, his voice low. "I'm leaving," she said, her own voice flat, dead. "I told you, I'm poison. I won't be the reason you're murdered. I won't have this cabin burned, this land taken." "Put the coat down." "No, this time you can't stop me. It's not a dream. Eli, it's not a ghost. It's real. They're coming for me. And they will kill you to get to me. I'll go north, into the hills. They'll follow me. You'll die." "It's better than you dying," she said, her hand on the bar of the door. He moved, faster than she could have imagined. He was not blocking the door. He was just standing in the middle of the room. "No," he said. "Eli, you don't understand." "I understand fine." His voice was not loud, but it filled the cabin. "You said you wanted to be mine. You said you wanted to belong here." "I do," she cried, tears finally breaking. "That's why I'm leaving, to save you. You leave, they win," he said, his voice hard as iron. "You run. You're just that church whore they named. You're just the runaway. You think that's saving me? That's saving nothing. That's letting them take you. And they ain't taking you." He stepped toward her. "I'll protect what's mine." It was a final, unbreakable vow. She looked at his face, at the cold resolve in his eyes. She was not leaving. He would not let her. And as she looked at him, she realized she was not just afraid for him. She was terrified of him. Terrified of the lengths he would go to, of the violence he was willing to unleash. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it would get him killed. She took her hand off the bar, She hung the coat back on the peg. She pulled away. Not physically, not at first, but a new, cold distance entered the cabin. She believed him. He would fight for her. And she believed, with all her heart, that he would die for her. The only way to stop it, the only way to save him, was to make him stop loving her. She began to build a wall, brick by painful brick. That night, she moved to the far edge of the bed, her back to him, her body rigid. When he reached for her, she flinched. "Don't," she whispered. He stopped, his hand hovering in the dark. "Clara, I can't, not when they're coming." He was silent for a long time. He pulled his hand back. The next day, she avoided his touch. When he handed her the coffee cup, she made sure their fingers didn't brush. She spoke only when necessary. In short, clipped sentences. She threw herself into her work, chopping wood with a frantic energy, scrubbing the floor until her knuckles were raw. He watched her, his face a mask of confusion and growing frustration. He tried to talk to her. "Clara, we need to plan. We need to—" "There's nothing to plan," she said, not looking at him. "They'll come, and you'll fight, and they'll kill you. That's the plan." "We can fight them. We can win." "No," she said, finally turning to him, her eyes hollow and cold. "We can't. You can't. You'll die. For me. For a damaged woman. I'm not worth your life. Eli, I'm not worth this land. Stop talking like that," he growled. "It's the truth," she cried. "You don't see what I am. I'm ruined. I'm the thing from the cellar. I'm poison. I told you, and now it's here." She would not let him near her. She slept wrapped in a quilt, a barrier between them. She was trying to break the bond, to make him see her as unworthy, to make him let her go. She was killing his love to save his life. The tension in the cabin grew thick and suffocating. For 3 days, they lived like strangers, the silence heavier than any argument. Eli's frustration mounted. He was a man of action, and she was fighting him with a weapon he couldn't see. On the 3rd night, he broke. She was lying in bed, her back to him, her body a rigid line of rejection. He had been staring at the ceiling, the moon painting a cold square of light on the floor. He got out of bed. She tensed, hearing the movement, but didn't turn. "Get up," he said. "What?" "Get up. Light the lamp." His voice was strange, a low, tight command she didn't recognize. Frightened, she did as he asked. She fumbled with the match, and the lamp flared to life, flooding the small cabin with harsh, yellow light. He was standing in the middle of the room. He was already unbuttoning his shirt. "Eli, what are you doing?" she whispered, clutching the quilt to her chest. He didn't answer. He pulled the shirt off and tossed it to the floor. He stood there, naked from the waist up. He turned, slowly, showing her his back. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. His back was a map of old. Terrible pain. A thick, puckered scar, round as a silver dollar, was burned into his right shoulder. A cattle brand? Below it, running diagonally, were the thin, white, overlapping lines of old lash marks, a dozen or more. He turned to face her. His chest was no better. The shrapnel wound from the war was a ragged starburst on his side, but there were others. A long, thin scar over his ribs. From a knife, a patch of skin on his arm that was smooth and waxy. A burn. He was a tapestry of violence and survival. He stepped closer, into the full light of the lamp. His eyes were burning into hers. "You think you're the only one?" he asked, his voice raw. "You think you're the one who's damaged?" He pointed to the brand. "My father, I was 12, for letting a calf stray." He pointed to the lash marks. "A cattle drive. The trail boss thought I was stealing. I wasn't. He didn't care. He touched the knife scar. A card game in a saloon. I was 17. He stood before her, his body a testament to a life of pain, a life of being broken and healing over and over and over. "You think broken means unlovable?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a pain she had never heard. She stared at him, her wall of rejection crumbling to dust. She was not looking at a protector. She was looking at a survivor. She was looking at herself. She slid from the bed. She didn't speak. She sobbed, a deep, aching sound of pure recognition. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the brand on his shoulder. Her fingers traced the white lines of the lash marks. You never... We all got scars. Clara, he whispered, his own voice thick. Some on the inside, some on the out. They just mean we lived. He cupped her face. You're not poison. You're a fighter, just like me. He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the river, or the hungry kiss of the barn. It was slow. It was tender. It was a joining of two broken, scarred, whole people. He lifted her and carried her back to the bed. He made love to her, this time with a reverence that made her weep. He kissed the jagged scar on her collarbone. He kissed the white lines on her wrists. He worshipped what others had tried to ruin. He claimed the broken parts, and he made them holy. She sobbed after, clinging to him, her face buried in his neck. The wall was gone. The distance was gone. They were one. The attack came 2 days later. It was mid-morning. The air was clear and bright. Clara was outside, hanging laundry on the line Eli had strung. She was humming, a small, tuneless sound. For the first time, she felt peace. A sound made her look up. Horses. Not one, many. She saw them at the ridge. 5 riders, dark against the blue sky. They were not wandering. They were riding hard, riding for the cabin. The peace shattered. Eli, she screamed, her voice ripping through the quiet. Eli, they're here! He burst from the barn, his rifle in his hand. He saw the riders, already halfway to the house, fanning out. Get inside, he roared, running toward the cabin. Bar the door! Clara ripped the wet sheet from the line and ran. She scrambled onto the porch as Eli took cover behind the water trough, levering a shell into the chamber. The men pulled up, just outside rifle range. They were hard men, their faces cold. The one in the center, a big man with a dusty black coat, was clearly the leader. Eli Morgan, the man shouted. Get off my land, Eli yelled back. We ain't here for you. Morgan, we're here for the whore. The man, Slade, yelled. We got a warrant from Laramie for Clara Sims, for attempted murder and theft. Give her to us, and we'll ride out peaceful. She's not going with you. Last chance. Slade raised his rifle. We're taking her, one way or the other. Go to hell, Eli fired. The shot kicked up dust near Slade's horse. The world exploded. All 5 men opened fire. Bullets thwacked into the logs of the cabin, splintering wood. Eli fired back, the heavy boom of his rifle answering the sharp cracks of their pistols. Clara was inside, her back to the barred door. She was not frozen. She was not the girl in the cellar. She ran to the wall and grabbed her Colt. She checked the load, her hands shaking, but steady. Clara, stay away from the window, Eli yelled from outside. One of the men had broken off, circling toward the barn, trying to get a flanking shot. Eli was pinned down. Clara saw the man through the side window. He was running low, aiming for the cover of the woodshed. From there, he'd have a clear shot at Eli's back. She moved. She went to the door, took a breath, and pulled the bar. She opened the door just a crack. The man was running, his back to her. She stepped onto the porch. She did not think. She just did as Eli had taught her. She raised the pistol with both hands. She aimed. She squeezed. The crack of the small revolver was sharp. She hadn't aimed for him. She aimed at the ground. The bullet hit the dirt just behind his heels. He yelped, spinning around, shocked to see her on the porch. Armed. The bitch is armed, he screamed. That second of hesitation was all Eli needed. He swung his rifle, fired. The man grunted, grabbing his shoulder, and scrambled back to join the others. Clara, get in, Eli roared. He ran from the trough, firing as he went, and dove through the open doorway. He slammed the door and dropped the heavy bar into place. They were inside. They were safe. For a moment, they were barricaded. Splinters of wood exploded from the window frame as a volley of bullets slammed into the cabin. Stay down! Eli shoved her toward the hearth, the only part of the room not in direct line of fire. He moved to the window, keeping low, and peered out. "They've taken cover," he said, breathing hard. "At the corral, it's a siege." He raised his rifle to fire again. A bullet came clean through the glass, screaming past his head. He ducked, but not fast enough. He grunted, a sharp, punched-out sound. He stumbled back, falling against the table. "Eli!" He looked down at his left arm. A long, red gash was torn through his sleeve, from his shoulder to his elbow. It was a graze, but it was deep. Blood was already welling, dark and thick. "Damn it," he hissed, pressing his hand to the wound. Clara stared at the blood. His blood, shed for her. The fear that hit her was cold and final. It was not for herself. It was for him. She didn't panic. She ran to the chest, ripped a clean linen sheet, and ran back to him. The men outside were shouting, but she didn't hear them. "Sit," she commanded. He slumped into the chair, his face pale. She tore open his sleeve, exposing the raw, bleeding wound. Her hands were perfectly steady. She pressed the linen to the gash, applying pressure. He winced, hissing through his teeth. It's just a graze," he muttered. "Be quiet," she ordered. She was focused, her eyes on the wound, on the blood, on the man who was bleeding for her. She held the cloth tight, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at his face, pale with pain, his eyes watching her. "I can't lose you," she whispered, the words torn from her. "Eli, I can't." He reached up with his good hand, his fingers stained with his own blood, and cupped her cheek. He held her gaze, his eyes fierce and unwavering. "Then don't run," he said, his voice low and steady, even as the bullets began to hit the logs again. "Stay and fight! Stay and fight!" Eli's words hung in the air as the next volley of bullets slammed into the log wall. The siege lasted for 3 hours. It was not a constant battle, but a war of patience. The men at the corral would shout threats, then fire a dozen shots, trying to get Eli to waste his ammunition. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his rifle across his knees. Clara had bound his arm tightly. The bleeding had slowed to a steady, sluggish ooze. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. "They're trying to wait us out," he muttered, listening to the shouts. "They think we'll panic." "Will we?" Clara asked. She was not by the hearth. She was sitting on the floor beside him, her own pistol in her lap, her back also to the wall. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her knuckles white on the grip of the Colt. "No," he said. The shouting from outside changed. A new voice. "Morgan, sheriff's here. Hold your fire." Eli and Clara looked at each other. "A trap? Eli Morgan." The voice was unmistakable. "Sheriff Brody, you in there? Hold your fire. I'm coming in." Eli moved to the window, peering through a crack in the frame. He saw Brody, riding slow, his hands high in the air. The 5 men were still at the corral, their rifles lowered but ready. "He's alone," Eli said. He moved to the door and pulled the bar. Sheriff Brody dismounted and stepped onto the porch, his face grim. "God almighty. Eli, you've started a war." "I didn't start it," Eli said, his rifle still in his good hand. "They're on my land." "They've got a warrant from Laramie," Brody said, his eyes falling on Eli's bloody arm. "They've got a right." "They've got no right." Clara's voice cut through. She was standing now, the pistol at her side. Brody looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a shadow in the general store, but as a woman holding a gun, her eyes blazing. "Ma'am, this is a bad business." He looked back at Eli. "Slade, the man in charge out there, he'll burn you out. He'll kill you. And the law will be on his side. He's a federal marshal. Eli, he's just deputized that whole bunch. He's a bounty hunter," Eli growled. "He's a bounty hunter with a badge. It makes all the difference. I can't stop him, not by force." "Then why are you here?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "Because I don't want to see a good man killed," Brody said, his eyes on Eli. "And I don't want a massacre in my county. Slade has agreed to a compromise." "What compromise?" Eli asked. his suspicion thick. A hearing. In town. Now. He presents his warrant. You present her. He nodded at Clara. We let Judge Harlan settle it. He's in town. Riding circuit. We do it legal. No more guns. Slade gets his hearing, and you get to defend her. A trial, Eli said, the word tasting like poison. It's not a trial, it's a hearing, Brody corrected. To settle the claim. To see if that warrant holds water. It's the only way you both walk out of this cabin alive. Otherwise, I'm riding out, and they're setting fire to your barn first, then your house. Eli looked at Clara. Her face was pale. She was terrified. She would be dragged into the open, her past picked apart by the men who had spat at her. We'll do it, Eli said. Clara's head snapped toward him. Eli, no, they'll lie. Let them, Eli said, his voice hard. You said you'd stay and fight. This is the fight. She looked at him, at the blood on his sleeve, at the absolute conviction in his eyes. She took a deep breath. She nodded. All right, we'll fight. The ride to town was a parade of humiliation. Eli and Clara rode in the center. Eli's arm in a makeshift sling. Clara's face pale. Slade and his 4 men rode behind them, their rifles held easy. A mocking, triumphant guard. Sheriff Brody rode in front, his shoulders slumped. He had kept the peace, but he looked like a man leading a funeral procession. The whole town was waiting. Word had spread faster than a prairie fire. The saloon, the general store, the smithy, all had emptied. The boardwalks were packed. People stood in the muddy street, silent, their faces a mixture of raw curiosity and cold judgment. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the back of Sheriff Brody's hat. She would not look at them. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. They did not go to the sheriff's office. It was too small. Brody led them to the saloon. It was the only building large enough to hold the crowd. The tables had been pushed to the walls. The bar was closed. At the far end, where the piano usually sat, a heavy oak table had been placed. Judge Harlan sat behind it, a grim, hawk-nosed man with eyes that looked like they had seen everything and believed none of it. Clear the room, Harlan ordered, his voice booming. This ain't a circus. Witnesses and principals only. Sheriff, keep the crowd at the doors. The townspeople grumbled, but they shuffled back, packing the doorways and pressing their faces against the dirty windows, turning the saloon into a fishbowl. Eli and Clara were motioned to a bench on one side. Slade and his men, 2 Laramie men she recognized with a jolt of terror, and the 2 bounty hunters, sat on the other. Sheriff, the judge said, state the business. Judge Harlan, Brody said, this is Marshal Slade, from Laramie. He's here to serve a warrant on this woman. Clara Sims, Eli Morgan, on whose land she was found, is disputing the warrant. We're here to settle the claim, to avoid further bloodshed. The judge looked at Slade. Show me the warrant. Slade, triumphant, swaggered forward and slapped the paper on the desk. Warrant for the arrest of Clara Sims, for the attempted murder of preacher Silas Sims, and for theft of property from the Laramie Sanctuary for Wayward Women. The judge read the paper. He nodded. It appears in order. He looked at Clara. Ma'am, you are accused of grievous crimes. It's a lie, Eli said, his voice low. You'll have your turn. Morgan, the judge said. He looked at Slade. Present your witnesses. Slade grinned. He called the first man. He was slick, dressed in a black suit, his face pale and fleshy. Clara remembered him. He was the clerk, the one who took the money. This is Mr. Davies, Slade said. He ran the books for the sanctuary. Mr. Davies swore on a Bible, his hands smooth and dry. Preacher Silas took that woman in, he began, his voice oily and practiced. She was a street girl, lost to sin. He gave her a home. He gave her God. And she repaid his kindness with betrayal. Clara stared at her hands, her knuckles white. She was a temptress, Davies said, his voice rising, playing to the crowd at the windows. She seduced the preacher, tried to get him to abandon his holy vows. When he refused her, in his piety, she grew enraged. She stole from the poor box. I counted it myself. Near $100 gone, and when he confronted her, she stabbed him. A holy man, in his own church. A murmur of horror ran through the crowd at the doors. She stabbed him with a fire poker, Davies continued, his eyes gleaming, and fled. She is a violent, unholy woman, a harlot and a thief. That's a lie, Clara cried, jumping to her feet. Silence, the judge roared. Sit down. Ma'am. Eli pulled her back to the bench, his hand a vice on her arm. Not yet, he whispered. Slade called his next witness, one of the guards, a burly, brutal-looking man. He repeated the story. He had seen Clara, half-dressed, fleeing the preacher's quarters. He had found the preacher bleeding on the floor, the empty poor box beside him. The lies were neat. They were clean. They painted a perfect picture of a fallen woman, a righteous man, and a just pursuit. The judge turned his cold eyes to Clara. Miss Sims, you've heard the testimony. What say you? Clara stood. The room was spinning. All those faces at the windows, at the door. They were all staring at her, their eyes filled with hate, with disgust. She saw Mrs. Henderson. She saw the men from the boardwalk. She started, her voice a dry whisper. It wasn't, he... Speak up, girl, the judge commanded. He was not a holy man, she said, her voice shaking. The sanctuary, it was a lie. Mr. Davies leapt to his feet. Objection! Slander against a man of God. She's a known liar. I'm not lying, Clara cried, the terror rising, choking her. It was a seller. He hurt us. He sold us. He... Sold you? The judge asked, his eyebrow raised in disbelief. She's mad, Davies scoffed. The sin has broken her mind. She's fabricating vile stories to cover her own wickedness. He's the liar, Clara pointed a trembling finger. He took the money. He held the key to the cellar. The crowd was murmuring again. But this time, it was not with horror. It was with a dark, cruel amusement, a mad woman's ravings. Clara looked around, her eyes desperate. She saw no friendly faces. She saw only judgment. She saw the cold eyes of the judge, the sneer on Slade's face, the oily pity from Mr. Davies. She broke. The strength that had held her in the cabin, the resolve that had held the gun, it all evaporated under the weight of their collective gaze. She was back in the cellar. She was the property. She was the whore. She sank back onto the bench, her body convulsing with silent, terrible sobs. She covered her face, trembling, defeated. The judge sighed, a sound of grim finality. The witnesses are credible. The woman is incoherent. I have no choice but to honor the warrant. No. The word was not loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Eli Morgan stood up. His sling was stained dark with fresh blood. His face was pale, but his eyes were on fire. You sit down, Morgan, the judge warned. This ain't your business. You're right, it's not, Eli said, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the room. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the townspeople, the faces pressed to the glass. It's not my business, just like it wasn't my business when Jed spat at her feet. He looked at the men on the bench. I know some of you. Henderson, the storekeep flinched. Abel, you and I, we rode herd together 5 years ago. He looked at the crowd. I've lived here for 10 years. I've buried my wife here. I've buried my son here. You know me. He paused, letting his words sink in. You know me, and you know I'm a man who wants to be left alone. He gestured, not at Clara, but at the Laramie men. And then these men, they come to my land. They come with badges and guns, and they tell me they're here for justice. They tell me they're here for a harlot who stabbed a holy man. He walked slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stood in the middle of the room. I found this woman half dead on my land, barefoot, in the snow, starved, beaten. He looked at Clara, who was watching him. Her sobs stilled. I saw the marks on her. I saw the wound that was festering. It was not the wound of a harlot. It was the wound of an animal, caught in a trap, that had to chew its own leg off to get free. The room was dead silent. Mr. Davies says she's a liar, that she's mad. Eli turned his burning gaze on the Laramie clerk. I look at you, Mr. Davies, and I see a man who's never missed a meal. I see a man with soft hands, who talks of sin while he runs a ledger. He turned back to the crowd. You want to see what evil looks like? You think it's this girl, who weighs no more than 100 pounds, who cries when she's accused. You think she's the evil? He pointed at Slade. Or is it a man who hunts a terrified woman for $50? Is it a man who brings 5 guns to a cabin to drag her out and calls it justice? Now you listen here. Morgan, Slade growled, starting to stand. I'm not done, Eli said, his voice dropping. You, all of you, you judged her. You called her whore. You spat at her feet. Because it was easy. Because she was alone. Because she was already broken. He unbuttoned his shirt, his good hand fumbling. He pushed it off his shoulders, letting it fall. He stood bare-chested, his sling hanging loose, the map of his own life's brutality exposed to the saloon. The brand, the lash marks. You think broken means unlovable? He asked, his voice raw. You think it means guilty? You think it means unworthy? He looked at the faces at the window. We all live in this territory. It's a hard land. It breaks all of us, every one of us. The only difference is, some of us get scars on the outside, and some of us, like Mr. Davies, grow them on the inside, like rot. He stood there, a scarred, one-armed testament to survival. This woman is not a harlot. She's a survivor, and what she survived, God help her. If she stabbed that man, I'd have given her a sharper poker. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. It was broken by a new voice. He's right. It was a man in the back, a thin, nervous man in a black suit, who had been sitting with Slade's men, unnoticed. He's right, the man said again. Louder, he stood up, trembling. Arthur, you sit down, Slade hissed. No, the man said, his voice shaking but finding strength. I won't. My name is Arthur Sims. A gasp went through the room. Silas. Preacher Silas. He's my brother. The crowd erupted. The judge hammered on the table for order. I was the bookkeeper, Arthur Sims said, tears streaming down his face. Davies was the clerk. He handled the customers, but I saw the real books. The ones we hid. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was what she said. It was a pit. My brother, he was a monster. You shut your mouth, you sniveling coward! Davies lunged at Arthur. Eli's good arm moved like a snake. He grabbed Davies by the shirt front and threw him to the floor. Let him speak, Eli commanded. I knew, Arthur sobbed. I knew it all. The cellar, the chains, the men. I saw the money. I was too afraid to speak. He threatened me, but I can't. Not after seeing. He looked at Eli, then at Clara. Did she stab him? The judge asked, his voice tight. Yes, Arthur said. She did. And he lived. He's not dead. He's in Laramie. He's angry. He wants her back. The warrant, it's a lie. He paid Slade to hunt her, to bring her back, not for justice. For punishment. The room exploded. The men at the windows were no longer curious. They were enraged. Liar! Someone shouted at Slade. Devil! Another yelled at Davies. The crowd surged through the doors, shoving past the sheriff. Slade, his face purple, drew his gun. This ain't over. I have a warrant. Eli stepped in front of Clara, but the townspeople were now between him and Slade. Henderson, the storekeep, his face white with shame, stood shoulder to shoulder with the blacksmith. You heard the man? Henderson said to Slade, his voice shaking. The warrant's a lie. You're a liar, and you ain't taking her. Get out of our town, a woman shouted. Slade looked at the ring of angry faces. He looked at Eli. He looked at the judge. He saw his $50 and his authority. evaporating. "This ain't done," he spat. He holstered his gun and shoved his way through the crowd, his men following like beaten dogs. Judge Harlan banged his gavel. "This hearing is concluded. The warrant is void. The charges are dismissed." He looked at Eli, who was helping a trembling, weeping Clara to her feet. "Mr. Morgan," the judge's voice was low, filled with a grim weariness. "You won, but you heard that man? The preacher is alive. Slade will be back, and he won't be back with a warrant. He'll be back with guns. I've seen his kind. For your own safety. For hers. Get out of this county. I can't protect you. I won't." They rode back to the ranch in a new kind of silence. The townspeople had watched them go, their eyes no longer cruel, but filled with a mixture of pity and awe. They had won, and they had lost. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting. It was the same cabin, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. They packed. It did not take long. A few clothes, ammunition, the coffee pot, 2 bedrolls. Eli took his wife's wedding ring, a simple gold band, from the small wooden box he kept it in, and slipped it into his pocket. Clara walked through the small room one last time. She touched the rough-hewn table she had scrubbed. She touched the hearth where she had huddled in terror. She stood by the bed where she had clawed at the walls, and where she had been held, and where she had been reborn. "Goodbye," she whispered to the empty, quiet room. It was just before dawn. The cabin was bare. The horses were packed. They sat at the table. A last cup of coffee, black and bitter. Eli looked at her. The faint gray light of the coming day softened the lines on his face. His arm was in a fresh sling. "Clara," he said. His voice was quiet, steady. He was not on one knee. He did not have a fancy speech. He just looked at her, his eyes holding hers. "I can't offer you this ranch. I can't offer you a peaceful life. It seems I can only offer you more trouble, more running." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, simple gold band. He laid it on the table between them. "But I will stand between you and all of it, every day, for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" Clara looked at the ring. She looked at his scarred, tired, beautiful face. She felt a love so profound it ached, a love forged in terror and blood and truth. She nodded, a small, slow smile touching her lips. "Yes," she whispered. "I will." She pushed the ring back toward him. "But you have to promise me something." "Anything," he said. "You'll never call me damaged again, not ever." A slow, real smile broke across Eli's face. It reached his eyes. "Never," he vowed. He picked up the ring and slid it onto her finger. It was too large, but it was real. The sun broke over the plain as they rode out. Eli barred the main gate, his one good hand sure and steady. He helped her onto the bay mare, then mounted his buckskin. Clara sat tall in the saddle. She was no longer the barefoot, terrified woman he had found by the creek. She was his wife. The small Colt revolver was strapped to her hip, open, the leather worn. They turned the horses, not east toward the town, but west, toward the unknown territory, toward the rising sun. And they did not look back. They rode west for 3 weeks. They crossed the high, brutal spine of the mountains, following game trails and the whispers of old trapper maps. The journey was a hardship, but it was a different kind of hardship than the one they had fled. This was a hardship of wind, and ice, and stone. It was clean. Eli's arm, bound tight, ached in the high altitude. He was a man of singular strength, but the wound and the blood he had lost left him weak. Clara, who had once been the passenger, was now the partner. She did the heavy work. She made camp. She dressed his wound. She took the first watch, her small pistol resting on her knee, her eyes scanning the dark. She hunted. He had taught her to shoot, and she was a good student. She brought back rabbits, and once, a small pronghorn, her hand steady as she worked the skinning knife. He watched her, his pride a quiet, warm thing in his chest. She was not the woman he had found. She was the woman who had been forged. They came down out of the high peaks into a new land. It was a valley, green and protected, boxed in by gentle, timbered hills, a wide, clear river, not a muddy, angry torrent cut through the center. It was a place, Eli noted, that a man could defend. There, he said one morning, pointing. Down there. They rode down into the valley. At the junction of two small creeks, a town was being born. It was not a town, really, but a collection of raw lumber buildings, smelling of fresh sawn pine and ambition. A sign, nailed to a post, read Willow Creek. They rode down the single street. It was a place of new beginnings. Men, covered in sawdust, were raising the frame of a new feed store. Women, their faces weary but hopeful, haggled over supplies at a mercantile that was still half tent. No one stared. No one whispered. They were just another man and woman, coming west to start again, in a town where everyone was from somewhere else. A past was not a liability. It was a given. They bought land, 10 miles upriver from the town, paying with the last of the gold coins Eli had sewn into his saddlebags. It was a good piece of land, a wide meadow protected by a bluff, with the river for water and the hills for wood. Eli began to build. He built their new home with his own hands. He felled the trees, his good arm and his slowly healing left arm, learning the rhythm of the axe again. He notched the logs, his work precise. The first cabin, the one he had built for Mary, had been a home for a life that was. This cabin was a fortress for a life that would be. It was solid, stout, and built to last 100 years. He built it with 2 rooms, a main room and a bedroom. He built a deep, wide porch, facing south, to catch the winter sun. While he built, Clara worked the land. She broke the sod for a garden, a patch twice as large as the one in Wyoming. She planted potatoes, but also corn and beans and squash. She planted zinnias, bright and useless, just for the color. She rode into Willow Creek. She found other women there, wives of new ranchers, daughters of storekeeps. They were women on the edge of a new world, isolated, strong, but ignorant of the dangers she knew so well. It started small. She met a young woman, not more than 17, whose husband was a freighter. He was gone for weeks at a time, leaving her alone in a cabin with only a rusty shotgun she did not know how to load. Clara brought her own Colt. "You need to know," she said, her voice quiet, firm. She took the girl out, and then another, and then another. They met by the river, a small, secret gathering. She taught them. She taught them how to load, how to aim, how to clean the weapon. "You do not fire to warn," she told them, her eyes hard, remembering the man who had flanked Eli. "You do not fire to scare. If you pull this weapon, you fire to stop the threat. You squeeze, you do not pull. You aim for the center. You do not stop until he is on the ground." The women watched her, their eyes wide. This was not the talk they heard from their husbands. This was the raw, hard truth. She taught them more. She taught them how to read the tracks of a man versus a deer. She taught them which plants could be used to stop bleeding. She taught them how to bar a door so it could not be kicked in. She taught them how to read. She had a book, one Eli had kept, a small, worn volume of poetry. She sat with them, her finger tracing the words, teaching them their letters. She was giving them the one thing that could not be taken, a mind that could think for itself, a quiet strength built in her. She was no longer Clara Sims, the victim. She was Mrs. Morgan, the teacher. When she walked through Willow Creek, people nodded. "Ma'am," they said, with respect. She had a place, she had a purpose, she had a name that was clean. Eli finished the cabin. He built a table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame, solid and strong. He planted trees, not just pine, but 3 small apple saplings, hauled by wagon from a town 50 miles south. He planted them in the front yard, a promise of sweet fruit in the years to come. On the porch, on the thick rail he had sanded smooth. He took his knife. He spent an entire afternoon. He carved her name. He carved Clara into the wood, the letters deep and sure. It was not a brand. It was a dedication. They settled. The summer was long and good. They worked, They spoke. They laughed. The laughter came easier now. They were building a life. Not just surviving one, but the past was not a dead thing. It was a scar, and scars ached when the weather turned. The first winter in the new valley was hard. The snow deep, the silence profound, and in the dark, the memories found her. She woke, her breath catching, her heart hammering, the scent of peppermint, the feel of cold chains. She sat up, a small cry in her throat, but the terror lasted only a V. Before the scream could form, Eli was there. He was not on the floor. He was beside her. He did not grab her. He simply laid his heavy, warm hand on her back. "You're here, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "You're safe. You're in Willow Creek. You're with me." She sagged, the tension draining from her in a rush. She was not in the cellar. She was in the cabin he had built. She was in the bed he had made. She turned and buried her face in his shoulder, her hands gripping his shirt. He just held her, stroking her hair, until her breathing slowed and she fell back into a safe, dreamless sleep. It happened again, perhaps a week later. The same ritual. She woke in fear. He spoke the words. The fear receded. The nights were no longer a battleground. They were just nights, the 5 times a night, the clawing, the screaming. That was a ghost. It was the memory of a fever, not the fever itself. Sometimes a month would pass with no dreams at all. She would sleep through the night, a deep, healing sleep, and wake to the smell of coffee. Eli already moving, the sun just touching the peaks. The winter was long, but it was not a winter of dread. It was a winter of peace. It was the last night of the long cold. A late snow was falling, thick, silent flakes drifting past the window. The fire in the hearth was built high, casting a warm, orange glow over the new log walls. They sat before it, comfortable in the silence. Clara had been staring into the flames. Eli was oiling his rifle. The snick-snick of the cloth, a small, domestic sound. She woke suddenly. She had not been asleep, but she had drifted. She woke, not with a gasp, but with a clear, sharp intake of breath. Eli's hand stopped. He looked at her. She was not afraid. She was just looking. She looked at the fire. She looked at the walls of her home. She looked at the man beside her. A slow, strange smile touched her face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She turned to him. Her eyes were clear, clear as the river outside. "It's gone," she whispered. "What's gone?" "The fear." She said it with a kind of wonder. I just waited for it. I felt the memory, but the fear, it's not there." She reached out and touched the puckered brand on his shoulder, visible above his undershirt. "It's just a scar now. Eli, it doesn't hurt." He put the rifle down. He looked at her, seeing the woman he had found and the woman she had become. He saw the peace that had settled on her face. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. He pulled her to him. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of the barn or the river. It was not the kiss of healing. It was the kiss of a man and his wife, in their home, safe. They made love by the fire. It was slow and fierce, and it was a final, definitive reclaiming of all that had been stolen from her. It was not about survival. It was not about desperation. It was about love, deep and quiet, and strong as the logs of the cabin. After, she lay in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the fire warm on her skin. She cried. They were not the sobs of terror, or grief, or even shame. They were the tears of a profound and absolute relief. The war was over. She was home. Months passed. The long winter finally broke. The valley turned a vibrant, shouting green. The apple trees Eli had planted sprouted small, hesitant leaves. Clara's garden was thriving. She began to feel different. It was not a sickness, not a return of the fear. It was a deep, bone-weary tiredness that settled on her in the afternoons. She felt a queasiness in the mornings, a strange distaste for the smell of the coffee she had always loved. She thought, At first, that she was ill. She told herself it was just the long winter, that her body was still mending. One morning, she was kneading bread. A wave of dizziness, coupled with a sudden, violent nausea, made her brace herself against the table. Eli, who had been watching her from the doorway, went still. He had seen this before. He had seen this tiredness, this morning sickness, this change in a woman's body. He had seen it with Mary. He crossed the room. She looked up, her face pale. I don't know what's wrong with me. Eli, I feel strange. He did not speak. He just laid his hand, his rough, scarred, gentle hand, on her belly. "You're not sick, Clara," he said, his voice thick. She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What? When was your last—" Her eyes widened. Her own hand came up to cover his. She did the math. She thought of the missed days, the tiredness. It was not sickness. It was life. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Eli." Tears welled in her eyes. This body, which she had known only as a source of pain, a thing to be broken, used, and sold. It was creating, it was making a new life, their life. He pulled her to him, his arms tight, his face buried in her hair. He was shaking. He had thought that part of his life was gone, buried on a cold hill in Wyoming. He had been a man of endings, and now, here, in this valley, he was being given a new beginning. They cried together. They stood in the middle of their cabin, surrounded by the silence of the meadow, the faint light of the new spring, and a hope so fierce it was almost painful. The summer grew. Clara's body swelled. The quiet strength in her face was softened by a new, deep serenity. She still taught the women, but she sat more, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. The final scene is this. It is late afternoon, in the fall. The air is crisp, the leaves on the hills turning gold. The first snow has already touched the highest peaks. Clara sits on the porch, in a rocking chair Eli built for her. She is heavy with child, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the strong, tumbling kicks from within. She is watching the sun go down, painting the valley in shades of rose and purple. She is not afraid. Eli is on the porch with her. He is not idle. He has a block of good, clean pine, and he is carving. His knife moves with a steady, practiced skill. He is carving a cradle. The wood is smooth, the rockers true. He is carving a small, simple willow leaf into the headboard. He finishes the leaf, brushing the shavings from the wood. He looks up. He sees his wife, watching him, her face full of a quiet, settled love. He sees her, safe on the porch of the home he built, carrying the child they made. He looks at the valley, their valley, and at the solid logs of their home. He looks back at her, his eyes, which had seen so much of war and loss, now filled only with her. He smiles. "No one will ever take from us again," he says. "Thank you for spending your time with this story. It's a hard world, but a good one. We here at From Wild West would surely love to know where you're listening from. Go ahead and leave a comment and tell us. Please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and be sure to share your thoughts on Eli and Clara's journey.